You want a dark aesthetic, but you still crave saturated colors, mixing and matching unconventional patterns, eccentric details. Maybe your favorite fairy tale growing up was Alice in Wonderland, and you are drawn to the style and aesthetics of Vivienne Westwood. My name is Melissa, and this is part of a series talking about the 5 dark aesthetic muses. If you are at a loss for inspiration and you want to aim for a dark aesthetic, I recommend dressing like either a vampire, a witch, a siren, a haunted doll, or a fairy. And this is the final installment of the series, so I hope you enjoy. I've been getting a lot of questions lately of why did I narrow it down specifically to these 5. So when I was drafting up the idea of making a video talking about these 5 dark muses, I wanted to pick entities and muses that were pretty broadened and they could be expanded upon based off of your personal style and liking. I've been asked, where does werewolf fit in? Where does dark hobbit or dark elf fit in? So the thing is, when it comes to these 5 muses, they are inherently dark. There are darker themes about them. There are dark origin stories to these fantastical muses that you can aim for. I decided on not including werewolf, even though I really debated on it. The werewolf style that I envisioned and so many of the different styles that could fall under that is still a little too specific, and I think the werewolf style deserves a video on its own. When it comes to hobbit styles or elven styles, they are not inherently dark. The term of dark hobbit core or dark elven style, the darkness has to be added on to it. Whereas the style fairy, the fairy in itself has a dark origin story, and any iteration that feels a bit light and airy was actually an added iteration. It is typically described as a mythical and magical creature, but whenever it comes to the origin of fairy itself, they are portrayed as benevolent, but can also be mischievous, and depending on the story, but most of the time, fairies are depicted as beings that you need to be careful around. Fairies are usually conceived as being characteristically beautiful or handsome, and they have no souls and at death simply perish. Further proving the point that unlike hobbit or elven styles, the fairy in itself has a dark rhetoric, a dark story. And there's nothing wrong with having a dark hobbit core or a dark elven style, but I don't think they themselves belong in the 5 broadened muses, whereas fairy in itself is a dark muse. And the purpose of this series is which of the broadened, larger picture muse should you aim to be inspired by? And that's why I landed on these 5. So at its core, how would you describe dressing like a fairy that has a dark aesthetic? Fairy style, unlike the other 4 muses, they have the most saturated color palette. Unlike vampire, which you have the blacks and bloody reds, and witch, which has these earthy muted tones, fairy is going to be the most saturated colors, mimicking the bright colors that you often see in a garden and maybe a twisted fairy tale. I envision fairy to have a mix of patterns, playing around with plaids and stripes. They are playful and experimental, just like its origin names. It feels sharp and abrupt, and also styles that we see in the 1980s new wave, new romantics, the 80s trad goth, variations of punk, J-rock fashion, and the 2000s emo or scene super bright and color styles. The purpose of the 5 muses is to step away from celebrity worship and idolizing people in general, and it's kind of nice to take inspiration from something that feels a bit more abstract. However, sometimes it does help to have some form of an example at the beginning of your style journey and then eventually branch off into being more inspired by the abstract. Some real life examples that I would say these people fall under the dark fairy aesthetic. So one, my friend Peyton, who is an eyelash artist and a traditional artist, she herself is like the epitome of a dark fairy muse. She has gone through so many different color variations in her hair. She has a pixie cut that is short, sharp, and abrupt, which is again like the dark fairy. In terms of her eyelash work, is the epitome of what I would recommend for the fairy aesthetic. She has these gradient lashes that can feather at the end that have a pop of color, or she does like various colors within the eyelashes that are extremely experimental, but I think are very incremental to the fairy aesthetic. The dark fairy look is going to be colorful, but not in a bright poppy way. Like, you can tell that this is still an alternative look. In terms of celebrities, I feel like the closest in terms of the dark fairy aesthetic is FKA Twigs. I've mentioned her before in my other videos, but I've always mentioned like she kind of gives a fairy slash doll look, and in some cases some of her dresses where they're a bit more flowy, she sometimes gives a fairy witch aesthetic. But because she often plays around with different play and patterns, and she's always doing something fun and experimental, I feel like fairy is probably like her core dark aesthetic. Hopping onto that, there are some designers that we have seen on runway that do embody the dark fairy aesthetic. In this first image, we have my favorite Kristen Ritter in Vivienne Westwood. I think most of Vivienne Westwood's collections
So I made a mistake in this video. I said that this dress was Vivienne Westwood, but this is actually from a brand called Pristine, which they are super talented. As you can tell, I thought they were Vivienne Westwood, but that was my bad for not double checking my resources. I definitely think you should check them out. This dress definitely still fits the fairy aesthetic.
Embody this dark fairy aesthetic, and Vivienne Westwood's styles in general were what I envisioned when I was thinking of what would fit in a modernized casual dark fairy look. It's a lot of short silhouettes, a lot of play with pattern and colors, but it still feels alternative. And Vivienne Westwood did take a lot of inspiration from the punk subculture, so you definitely see influences of that. We also have Betsey Johnson. I especially would recommend looking into her 90s iteration because she was also inspired by punk as well as grunge, but she incorporated these saturated colors and mix of pattern. Now, when it comes to the 5 dark muses or taking inspiration from anything in general, I actually really don't recommend taking inspiration from just one thing, but to take inspiration from a multitude of resources so that it ends up becoming your own because you're mixing and matching things. So let's say you are mainly inspired by fairy, but you want some influences of the other muses such as vampire. So the vampire fairy or the fairy vampire is going to have pops of that bright red. It's this nod to the bloody reds that is associated with vampires. It is darker than fairy, but it is brighter than the traditional vampire aesthetic that I have talked about before. The flowers and floral motifs that I would recommend for a fairy style, it's going to be less lively, so think dead roses or poisonous flowers. Again, when it comes to the fairy aesthetic, think in your mind what comes off as devious, cunning, and to make it vampiric, theatrical. This could be 80s trad goth or new romantics to take inspiration from in terms of makeup or theatrical styles. Now, when it comes to the fairy witch, I have mentioned before in my witch breakdown that I would look to the early 2000s or the 90s where Whimsigoth, which I don't think it was coined that until recently, but Whimsigoth was definitely prevalent during the 90s. So you have the likes of Practical Magic, Hocus Pocus, and these bright velvets, but they're still witchy. That is how I envision the fairy witch or the witch fairy. But here are some additional inspirations if you are inspired by both fairy and witch. The fairy witch is going to be a bit more desaturated in the color palette. Even though fairy on its own is very colorful, when you think of witch, I think of something very earthy, muted, the colors of nature. So the colors are going to be a bit desaturated. It's a little cottagey with a fantastical feel, very fairy tale or folklore, and play with layers to make it very witchy, and don't forget playing around with the different textures. This is going to have more natural fibers incorporated, whereas Pure Fairy can have a mix, and the colors are going to be a bit more neutral, and I think this is going to have a bit more nature motifs. Out of all the Muses, I feel like Fairy Siren is going to be a little bit different, a bit of an oxymoron, but you know I love these kinds of juxtaposition when it comes to styles, because the more different your inspirations are, the more interesting I think your style can be. The reason why these two are a little different, so you have Fairy, which is short and abrupt lines, very sharp and kind of in your face, whereas Siren is muted, subtly sultry, and the colors, even though I see like oceanic blues, blacks, when you mix the two together, you get something quite interesting. The colors are going to be a bit more saturated, but they're still oceanic influence. So saturated blues and greens. Think a colorful siren. I can also envision shell-like details, but in a cyber way, kind of like this necklace that I put in the middle. The pieces are going to be asymmetrical, just like the woman I have to the far right or left, the far corner. She has an asymmetrical one shoulder top, but I can also see that in a skirt iteration. The silhouettes are going to still be longer just to mimic that siren-like look. But I think the prints and patterns that you could play around with are ink prints and splatters. So they still feel a bit oceanic, but it has that fun and play that is still fairy. When it comes to Fairy Doll, or the doll Fairy, these two I feel like there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of fun with details and different trinkets that you can play around with that still feel doll or still feel fairy. I also think Amy Lee of Evanescence also fits into this fairy doll look. Sometimes Evanescence also gives off a siren aesthetic, but in a lot of the photo shoots that I remember her in, where she has like her striped gloves and she has a very colorful backdrop, I envision fairy for her. The fairy doll is like a more colorful doll. This is also where I see Alice in Wonderland fitting in. Whether it's the traditional Alice in Wonderland you remember from storybooks, the Disney iteration, the Tim Burton version, or even the American McGee video game. This could also be a darker Peter Pan, again, very fairy tale like. The saturated colors is very bright but twisted, a fairy tale gone mad. It can still be frilly and soft and feminine like you would imagine for doll, but a little less modest since fairy is like short and sharp lines. Its eccentric charms and mix and match patterns. As you can tell based off of my references and my abstract inspirations, or I try to go for abstract, this is definitely where the different Alice in Wonderland iterations fit in. During the early 2000s, during my emo days of being a middle schooler, that was definitely one of the main inspirations that I often saw throughout shopping and looking for and exploring my own personal dark aesthetic. There were different Alice in Wonderlands going around in terms of different iterations, but American McGee was actually, the video game was one of the biggest influence during my time, and I noticed that was actually a huge influence in terms of style. You have the striped tights that was actually very prevalent during the time. My art teacher in middle school actually often wore striped tights, and they felt very Alice in Wonderland or like a twisted fairy tale. This is also the aesthetic that I envision Monster High dolls to fit in the most. Now, I did not grow up with Monster High dolls, but from what I can see and speculate and have seen in store, I feel as though Monster High, due to its high saturated colors and oftentimes short silhouettes and play with different textures and so much patterns, most of the Monster High characters would fit in the fairy aesthetic, but different subgenres based off of which Monster High doll you prefer. Now let's talk about the fairy makeup. So whenever it comes to the fairy makeup, envision something, again, like I keep repeating, saturated and colorful, but also something experimental. Again, the origin of this dark fairy look is cunning and kind of devious. So think of unapologetic makeup looks. Again, this is going to be the most experimental. Think shimmery fairy dust, colorful, maybe a graphic eyeliner, glued on pieces, maybe like gluing on butterflies on your face or pearls, and really think of your face and makeup as a work of art. So normally this is the part in the video where I give recommendations of where to find the pieces to start your collection, or if you're curating your wardrobe to be one of these 5 muses. When it comes to the fairy aesthetic, this is definitely the muse that is probably going to be the most DIY. As you can see from the earlier slides, a lot of the fairy influence does take inspiration from punk, with the mix and match of patterns, the imperfections in the different layers. So how else to achieve that the most is to DIY it yourself, or to go thrifting, or to go vintage shopping. The fairy DIY details that I recommend looking into is possibly picking up a skill such as knitting or crochet. Crochet is always handmade. There is no machine that does crochet, so that's definitely something to think about. Grommets, corsetry, and safety pins are also great embellishments to think about when personalizing your pieces. And maybe look into different printings and dyes to really make your closet your own. You can also look into rough ties, just as you see as this image to the left of the text, where you have like this rough corsetry details, or this bag made out of pure silk knots. If you liked all of the visuals that I incorporated in my video, I compile everything into a PDF and I have it available for my Patreon members. I hope you enjoyed this 5 Muse series. Even though this is the last installment, this is definitely not the end. I am gonna be working on some videos talking about different styles and how these 5 muses work into it. The next video that I'm thinking of is talking about the modern medieval style and how to make it vampiric, or how to make it more witchy, so on and so forth. I hope you have a great one, and until next time, bye.